Here it is again, the third episode of Flat Art Show. This is a conversation between myself, Evan Dom, and Blue Delliquanti. Blue like the color, Delliquanti, Delliquanti. If you go to thatname.com, that seems to be a handy overview of their work generally. They're a cartoonist in Minneapolis. Thank you for being here. See you.
I just finished grading my homework for the week and prepping my lesson for the week. So I'm in a pretty teachy frame of mind, I guess you can say.
And you're teaching a comic-specific class. I think it's somewhat more technical than mine. Is that right?
I guess so. I'm trying to remember what you specifically are teaching. What I teach in the fall at MCAD, which is the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, I teach a class called The Comic Scene, and that is sort of an intermediate level class. It's after students have started the comics program proper and have done some introductory classes, but it's before they leave. And it specifically focuses on perspective drawing and world building and environmental design, which I've come to find that I have a lot of opinions about. And I found that I enjoyed teaching it because the students always come in very nervous. They do not want to learn perspective drawing. They do not want to do math. But when they come out, they have massively improved their art and they know it. So the morale is high, I think, when that class is over.
Cool. I don't do anything that technical. I sort of like, I teach the web comics class at SVA, and it's an elective, and it's somewhat marginal to people's trajectory through the comics department. So, like, it has turned out to be not extremely technical, and I'm mostly just kind of trying to frame what they're doing in, like, some kind of picture of a career or picture of the industry. Mm-hmm. But that's such a different experience to like teach fucking perspective.
It is, and I did not. So I didn't go to art school. A lot of what I learned artistically is self-taught, and a lot of the perspective I learned from books, and I learned just from like brute forcing, like learning why certain things worked and why they didn't. I think I'm kind of the opinion that at this point, during the pandemic, I think most of MCAD's comic students pivoted to a digital tool set. Not entirely, but like I would say at this point, it's like 75% at least. And so they have tools, usually Procreate, because these are all like iPad users. But, they have tools to mock up perspective for them if they desire. So I've been trying to frame this more of a understanding why you're seeing the world the way you do and understanding why things look wrong so you can troubleshoot them without basically like relying on Procreate or Clip to do it for you. Yeah. And then we also get to the part that they genuinely like, which is the world building part, which, that is a little more palatable to them maybe than like figuring out the specifics of isometric perspective. But yeah. And I think I figured out how to do it.
That's like theory stuff, so that can be kind of more fun to talk about.
Yeah, there's I think there's like interesting things that you can talk about. I have one of the materials that I refer to is a series of essays, I guess you can call them, by a guy named Paul Ravache. He's a concept artist and I've realized this is like increasingly like less relevant to students every year, but he did a lot of background designs for what used to be called kids WB shows, like Static Shock and Batman the Animated Series and stuff like that. He's like that kind of like character and environment design guy, but he has a really handy series of texts where he goes into the idea of like actively observing the things that you see, being able to break them down into parts or start thinking about how you break them down into parts, and to try and actively take with you the things that you see around you, and not just kind of relying on your passive memory of a place or an object or anything, which I think is genuinely really useful, especially for things that are, scary to draw, like trees. Students hate drawing trees. They hate when I make them draw trees.
Yeah, me too, man. It seems like yeah, I have a parallel experience. So I was in an art school, or I was in like a fine art department of my school for like a year and a half. So I have like some, I guess, art education, but most of my field is not in fine art, and most of what I have learned that's like applicable to making comics, I have come the long way around to, in a way that is like what you're talking about. So it's bizarre. So I'm only on my third semester teaching, and it's bizarre to be in this institution where all this knowledge is institutionalized, and all the people, all the other teachers. It feels like a lot of the other teachers like know all this stuff in a more rigorous and systematically learned way. And I'm teaching
Yeah.
these students this stuff that like I don't really have a systematic thing on it. It's a weird experience.
You're still kind of figuring out like what your pedagogy is. That's the big word. That's the word that I picked up in my first
Yeah.
couple years, is like, what's your pedagogy? Like, what goals are you trying to accomplish or whatever? It also is really good at exploring the holes that you have in your technical skill set. Like, I
Yeah.
really don't know how to use InDesign properly, and every year I will tell myself that I will sit down and learn, and I still haven't.
Hmm.
So I just try and get around exercises where one could conceivably use InDesign and do something usually a little more low tech.
Yeah. That's in the category of stuff that I learned just growing up with graphic designer parents. So that's
Oh
what I
yeah,
have
that's right. That's like a
instead of a
very
formal one.
specific skill
Yeah.
set that would be useful.
I Yes, it reveals a lot of holes in my conception of what I'm doing, but also like I'm a I don't think in terms of objective. I don't know. I feel like I don't think about what I'm doing in a way that is easy to connect to an institution. I'm trying to advocate for like self-publishing and thinking of comics outside of objective standards and institutions and stuff, and that's my pedagogical challenge or that's my dialectic to work through over the coming years.
That's another $5 word, dialectic.
Yeah, it's a keeper.
Yeah, I found that like I often, when it comes to teaching anything, or talking about anything really, I often find myself compelled to tell it as a story. And that's something that is helpful for me to explain a particularly complicated concept. It's also, I think, kind of helpful to explain lots of things in comics as like a history, I guess you can say, or as like a body of literature. I think I might have told you this story before, but I don't teach a class that's entirely devoted to webcomics, but every spring I get invited to my colleague Diana Green's history of comics class, and she's like, you know more about webcomics than I do. Come on in and tell them about the trajectory of webcomics. And I go, okay. So I try to think about this as like a story with players who will pop up again and again.
Hmm.
As is the way. Some people have been making digital media for, over 2 decades at this point. But the thing that's always interesting is, there's a lot of web like media that is opaque for people who are just not around for most of the story. And the thing that I always like telling people about, terminally online millennials like you and I will draw the lost diagram on the whiteboard. And at this point, I'd say still like 80% of the students recognize it every time, but they have no idea where it's from. So I basically like walk them through the story of Control Alt Delete and lost.jpg and kind of how that happened.
Yeah,
Because I feel like
they would have been like 6 years old when that was
yeah,
out or
honestly,
something.
yeah, at this point they would have been like elementary schoolers, like
Yeah.
maybe. So, you kind of have to like talk about like, yeah, there's this, huge chunk of webcomics that was all like guys on a couch playing video games. And, yeah, this one guy tried to like give his characters an inner life, and his like readers were so dumbfounded they like took this thing they didn't understand and spun it into a meme that is now so atomized that like in 200 years anthropologists will have screaming matches over its over its significance. Like that I think is like a really fascinating story to me. There's a lot of them in webcomics. And just like it's weird to say if you weren't there, because frankly I wasn't there for a lot of it. I just kind of absorbed it through having people who are even like 5 years older than me in my professional orbit. But it's kind of a canon of sorts. There's a lot of interesting people involved.
Yeah, and it's you did have to be there kind of because it's a marginal part of a marginal medium.
Yeah.
So it is very difficult to reconstruct. I think more difficult than like other creative fields maybe. Like I just did a couple weeks ago my big history of webcomics talk, which is somewhat bloated and ridiculous and polemical. But yeah, it's so much of this stuff is just in my memory now, and no one wrote it down. And of the like 3 books that have ever been written that are like a history of comics in this field, a lot of it is it's funny how important and huge it feels to me, but it's a pretty marginal space.
It is, but it's kind of a really interesting like companion story to the trajectory of the internet as a whole. And I know exactly what you mean about it kind of being oral history and, not being recorded properly. Like I also talk about the Project Wonderful thing. And, externally you can probably get a decent understanding of how that happened, but most of the like actual like factual information I got about it I got from like a blog post from Kel McDonald. And if I was not there, I wouldn't be able to tell you who was the one person who tanked Project Wonderful kind of over the course of a month. Like, I don't think that is like publicly available, but I know it. Lots of people in my circle know who that was.
I forgot about that. I don't think that I know that.
Oh, I'll tell you later. I feel like
okay, no sweat.
Yeah.
I mean, Project Wonderful. You're talking about like individual players who emerge in this space and become like a historical. Ryan North is that person to me. He was a formative, artist in that world, and then he like really built these institutional things like Project Wonderful that were, I don't know, that helped sustain the field in that period before it was all sort of bulldozed by the current shopping mall internet.
Mm-hmm. It's like a really interesting tool, and like something that kind of only specifically worked for comics, because if I'm like remembering the details of it correctly, like because most comic websites didn't have as much text as other websites because they're all JPEGs, like you couldn't, have bots crawling over it to try and like, generate the right kind of ads for it. So it gave like those creators, those site runners more control. Like, I don't know, like that was a really good like tool. And I think that is like going to be a huge part of Ryan North's legacy, like in one way or another. That and dinosaur comics.
I mean, how much is that a thing that's known about outside of people exactly our age in exactly our field?
I mean, that's the thing. I'm not sure. Like, I feel like there's a lot of, foundational, like, digital infrastructure that is kind of mystified to people. Like RSS feeds, I still have to kind of consistently explain.
Oh, God.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I mean, like, HTML, and I have a feeling we're going to like get into like kind of cantankerous, like, territory here, but like HTML as a skill set, even like a rudimentary skill set, is like totally like off the table. There's like always one kid, there's always like one person who is like, making a NeoCities page and is a little more, savvy because they
Hmm.
do it for fun, but they didn't do it as like a social exercise the way like we might have to make
Yeah.
our Sailor Moon fan pages in like 1999 or whatever.
Okay, this is the big shift, right? I mean, I'm trying to I'm all I'm doing thinking about this stuff lately is trying to encapsulate what the fuck, what has happened, what the shift was, right? And it used to be on the table for us to imagine taking ownership of these places. It used to be on the table for us to imagine making a really ambitious comic book and self-publishing it. We can still do that, but it's not on the table for people to imagine. It's not on the table for people somewhat younger than us to even see as a possibility because
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, the scale of everything has changed. Or like, you can learn HTML, you can make your own website now. Probably you can still build some facet of a career in independent art doing that now, but we don't live in a world where that's ideologically on the table in the same way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. There's some things that have changed that are, I think, like ideologically neutral, which is just that there are many more people.
Yeah.
And, that means that not everybody is going to be, in the same like spaces anymore, whether that's, like the same kind of handful of like, forums, like I'm thinking like the flight anthologies, like all of those people like kind of all congregate on the same forum originally, yeah, or like
Yeah.
comics Twitter, like nascent comics Twitter, or any of these places that are still like kind of relatively graspable as a single community, or maybe like a handful of communities, like a single digit amount of communities. And
Hmm.
that's not the case anymore, which is like fine, and honestly that can even be healthy. But yeah, there is also like a shift to migrating to walled gardens, I guess you can say. Like Discord's kind of a great example, right? Because if one were to, here I'll give like an example. So I have a old Nintendo 3DS that I jailbroke to play some like games for free, and there is a really handy like Google document that explains how to do that. But if you want to like have continuous help, or like you want to get like a sounding board from other people who are in this community, that there's no longer a public forum, or at least the public forum on a website that anyone could conceivably access on a browser, like that is not the main vehicle for finding that community anymore. It would be on Discord, which is
Right.
like by necessity like more removed and more isolated, which
Not
is kind of a
searchable and
bummer. Like that's kind of like not even going into like websites or social media or something. That is like a shift in how communities form online that I think is like fundamentally changed.
yeah. And it's a reactive shift. I feel like it's reactive to the sort of walled gardenness of the web, the browser internet.
Something that I often think about whenever I feel down about the state of the internet is trying to think of the positive experiences I've had, like going online and browsing a space or discovering a space. And the two like types of experiences I can think of are finding like old websites, things that are relics from this earlier internet, which I remember doing. I was working on Across the Field of Starlight, my like graphic novel firm, a few years ago, and I was looking up, I don't know, I think I was trying to come up with numbers for how far apart certain stars are from each other, like in the Milky Way, to try and like reverse engineer like a BS like amount of like how far a vehicle, a faster than light vehicle would have to go to get places. And I found this website that was like generously updated last in like 2005. And it was really refreshing in that it was like very simply laid out, but all the information was like very like clear, and there hadn't really been a lot of like degradation or link rot or anything, and it provided exactly what I needed. And that was like handy in terms of clarity. There's
I
also
think
like I don't know.
I think I have seen that exact. Well, there's this one website that reminds me of that's like of about that same sort of design vintage, and it's just pages and pages of pretty like physically plausible, like speculative spaceship shit for your science fiction story or stuff.
I think that's different
remember-
than the one I'm thinking of, but I would love to see whatever you're talking about.
Oof, it's probably in the bookmarks on my other computer. Maybe I can find it. It was very cool and detailed. Actually, this is going to be a public podcast. This is the sort of thing that people who hear it wouldn't probably recognize and be able to point us to.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Like
yeah,
that kind of thing. I love that kind of thing. I feel like another like typical kind of website that falls into this category are if you ever look at like tarot anything or astrology anything, or honestly the one that I think I came across in the wild was like I Ching anything. I'm really interested in like studying the I Ching, and like oh boy, I don't think anybody has made an I Ching website since like 2010. Like they all have a very specific like janky kind of look to them that's like fun to explore, because those look like a labor of love. Like even if those kind of like tend to fall apart at the seams HTML wise, they're like fun to look at as something that like someone left their digital thumbprint on. But honestly, like when I think of like a new experience, like a recent creator's work that made me excited to explore a website and move around, it was John Boyce, 1770-76. The way like I first accessed that site and navigated that narrative was completely eye-opening. And I think about that a lot. And I think about if I were to, make a natively digital narrative again, how could I invoke anything like what John Boyce did for that?
Yeah, it is exciting. You're into Superpose, right?
Oh yeah.
Their fucking website, incredible. The presentation of that comic is incredible. We talk more about that later, but yeah, I know what you mean. There was this period of like before the internet and before like web comics broadly became like professionalized in the way that they became. There was a lot of experimental stuff like that. People were doing wild things with like GIFs and animation and infinite canvas and everything in ways that fell out of favor, I think, because of everybody's on the internet on their phones now. And the platformization.
I mean, like, what's ironically, like, we're kind of better equipped than ever to explore infinite canvas stuff. There's a comic that I share in my intro class, my introduction to comics class every year. That's a Drew Wine comic from 2005 called "Pup Contemplates the Heat Death of the Universe."
I literally showed that exact example to my students like 2 weeks ago. That's funny. That's one of my I love that comic. Yeah.
Which is hilarious because like if you load that comic today, like it's still perfectly accessible, but there's like a little note in the beginning, like, hey, let your page load for a couple of minutes, like go get a cup of coffee or something to let it load in its entirety, which is, kind of like a charming, like, of its time thing. But like, I don't know if I've tried accessing it on my phone, but like theoretically, like you could explore that just fine. Like phones are kind of better equipped than ever to explore infinite canvas stuff. But like, as you said, they kind of fell out of favor, or, they were kind of like the experiments and the like eccentric versions of it are often like more specific to like individual people.
And it's hard to, I don't know, I don't think about mobile web browsing very much, I guess, but it seems hard to do like really aggressive experimental stuff in a way that ports reliably to phone web browsers. Maybe that's part of it. Like
Maybe.
I can't imagine looking at 1770 whatever it is on my phone or the Superpose website or any of these more like inventive HTML projects.
Yeah. I do wonder if there are like robust tools to let it like port in certain ways. But to be honest, I feel like there are a handful of people who will just format their pages differently for page viewing versus scroll viewing. So that
Hmm.
might just be a level of, arranging things differently in a way that, I don't know, suits those more. I'm not sure. I'm also like not as tech savvy as I think my reputation would make people think that I am. Technology is often scary and bad, and I don't like updating my computer. So I don't really know much about web development.
Oh, me neither. So do you? So oh, Human Star, you were doing online 2012 to when 2020.
Correct.
You're not putting comics online in that same sort of way since then, am I wrong? Do you interact with any of these spaces in that way lately?
Not in that way lately, not for lack of interest, but jobs keep happening that have me working in different ways. But I do have ideas for returning to that like serialized digital first model that I just have not had time to
Yeah.
execute. Because I do think it would involve like a little more like uh proactively learning about how to post things on a website in a way that my, you know, muscle memory of using Comic Press may not be able to cut.
Yeah. I mean, uh, I'm sure you could figure it out.
I'm
But
sure
yeah,
I could figure it out.
and also there's learning that stuff, but then there's also like I imagine learning. I mean, I was talking about this with EK, who started their new comic years after, their new like online free serialized thing years after being in that world. Like
Hmm.
there's a lot of the culture you kind of have to relearn is a big hurdle, I think. I mean, I don't know, but like when I started Third Voice after just a couple months of a break, and I really was trying to like relearn the culture and see how much stuff I was taking for granted, and it's an interesting challenge, I guess.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing more about that because I do feel like there is, you know, I wouldn't say I was like a maestro of managing, my digital footprint during my Oh Human Star days. Like I had, regulars who would, post on the comments below or would like reach out to me if I, announced my new pages on Twitter and Tumblr or whatever. But like I didn't really go, I don't know, every once in a while I would do like a Tumblr ask where I would like have a response to, somebody asking an in-character question. And that was something that I just kind of like took a leaf out of like Akewood's book, but
Hmm.
even I didn't do that as like robustly as Chris Onstad did it. Um but yeah, no, I feel like it would be interesting to see how that culture would change because I do think that there is a way to generate engagement as like yucky of a phrase as that is organically because I do feel like I see Max Graves do that for example with What Happens Next without really doing a lot of like bells and whistles on social media. Like I feel like he just kind of does that by like making a compelling thing that's like a car crash in slow motion that people have thoughts and feelings about. And like
Hmm.
that's kind of ideal to be honest, is just like to make a thing that people like, you know, have
Absolutely.
enthusiasm about when it updates wherever it
Absolutely,
updates.
that's ideal. And I mean, that's the engine that has made both of our careers work, I imagine, is just like,
Yeah.
I mean, I relate to what you're saying that I never knew how to be a person on the internet or how to popularize what I'm doing, but I leaned into what I was doing with the sort of at least an appearance of knowing what an appearance of confidence and vision. And like, Oh Human Star is such a fucking ambitious and confident project from the start that like you got to think that there's some momentum in just that fact, right? Maybe that gets complicated as the fucking internet changes, or as we and our aesthetics age out of the the core demographic of pop culture generally or whatever.
Yeah, maybe.
But
Yeah,
that's
I
something.
don't know. I don't know. It's hard to know like until you do it, right? And I feel like in that respect, you kind of are more, you know, actively doing that than I am at the moment. But yeah, I don't know. I to be honest, like I appreciate that, it looks like Oh Human Star is like executed, ambitiously and confidently from the start. I It feels weird to hear that and to reflect on where I was as a like 22-year-old doing this story for the first time, because I had a clear idea of like who these characters were and what I inevitably wanted to happen, but I was like fully prepared for me not reaching the end of the story. I kind of figured I would, like what happens with many webcomics, that I would just kind of,
Mhm.
peter out after 3 or 4 years, go do something else, get a real job or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
And
it's of course it would look totally different to you. That makes sense to me because it looks totally different. I was talking to in the conversation with Casey. He kept. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you.
no, go ahead.
He kept saying this thing about like how I always seemed to know what I was doing and I always had these big plans or whatever, but it always felt tenuous and stupid and like it was all going to fall apart on my end. That makes sense that it would feel differently to you than it
Right.
looks.
Yeah.
And of
Like
course,
there, there's
I just read the whole thing in like 3 or 4 days, so it feels like a real cohesive project in a way that it necessarily could never feel for you, probably.
oh sure. I mean, I think what's in my favor, right, or in Oh Human Star's favor rather, is that I was smart enough in the restraint that I put in early on to make this narrative as a whole feel more cohesive later as I became a better writer. I think what is like really common with webcomics is, they just kind of like are very obviously a product of like a person growing and changing as an artist. And, for most artists, the work that they do at like 22 is very different from the work that they do at 32, right? Both in terms of like their technical skill, but also just kind of like their narrative priorities or their, ideology or whatever. And what makes webcomics charming is that there's kind of that visible time capsule that you can see just how much the art styles changed, or the, like who these characters are or what they're trying to do. And, that can be for good or for ill, right? Like you can
Hmm.
be, this can be a, I immediately went to like, like Sinfest. Like, Sinfest is kind of fascinating as a time capsule because of how much that creator has changed over the years, right? I was trying to think of like a good example.
That does make the point, though.
Yeah, but like, I think that kind of comes with the territory. So maybe the thing that I at least had the foresight to do with Oh Human Star is to not make that super obvious, other than like, I don't know, I look at the art from chapter 1, I was like, "Who boy, I do not know how character proportions work." But like the color palette never changed. There was kind of a similar pacing
Hmm.
throughout. And again, the characters were very clear to me before I started, so they feel very consistent in a
Yeah.
way that I think people resonate with. But yeah, no, I don't know. I feel like if I had continued Oh Human Star even like 2 years later, I do feel like I would have, you know, been a significantly different storyteller at that point.
Um, that is hard to say. It does feel consistent to me. I don't see the failings in the drawing that you're talking about at the start, and a lot of this is like what you're saying. You it's drawn stylistically in a way that like just builds this continuity into itself in a really overt way. Does that make sense? Like it's always drawn and colored the same way.
Yeah.
Like your line quality is very consistent all throughout the whole thing. So like I can see that you're getting better and you're figuring it out, but it holds together in a really it holds together great, I think. And
Thank you.
I wonder about I guess we're talking about Oh Human Star in particular now.
Yeah.
I wonder about like the planning the story because I have my own angle on this experience. I did Vatu for 12 years and like planning that it looked very different at the end than it looked at the beginning. But Oh Human Star has this overt this what feels like a pretty rigid structure of like telling a past and a present story at the same time and like having things lead into things in this sort of I don't know, it feels very fucking structured and I just wonder like what did planning look like if you're starting out, like do you know the scale of it when you started out?
To be honest, I don't think I really had a realistic sense of the scale. I knew the very basic structure I felt like made sense for it to have. And when I say very basic, it's basically just like I had a sense of sort of like the high point and the low point and how I wanted it to resolve. This is a story I've told before as well, but like the premise of Oh Human Star, like the very basic like kicker of the story came to me in a dream when I was like maybe 20 or 21 years old. And it is like a very, very rough sort of like, it gave me the sense of like this inventor who wakes up, finds out that he's dead and is in a robot body and is trying to like track down the people that he knew in real life. And that's kind of it, other than a like brief kind of glimpse at the characters that would become Brendan and Sulla, and really more than anything else, like the tone and the mood of it, which was very like kind of cool and melancholy. And there were like specific texts and artists that I think kind of informed it as I was like, basically I was really infatuated with this idea. It intrigued me for reasons that at the time I really couldn't describe. I couldn't leave these characters alone. So I just kept drawing them and trying to figure them out, trying to figure out their dynamic. And through that kind of like digging around, I got an idea of what I felt like would be a fulfilling place for these characters to end up, which basically remained consistent, is like basically the ending of Oh Human Star. Mm-hmm. But like in terms of how to get there, there was the thing that I can definitely remember is that for the early parts of the story, it was a very small world. It was basically just the world of Al, Brendan, and Sulla, and they were kind of like the sole characters in this world that I realized, like, after I think the first, after thumbnailing the first like one or two chapters, which I'd kind of done before I'd made any final pages, I realized that was just like not going to work for how this world had to function. Like this had to be a world of like more than just three people and 3 points of view. And especially like for technology, that didn't match even like I think the popular like narratives of technology, like your like the story of like how Apple was founded or how Facebook was founded or whatever. Even in the like, fictionalized versions of those, there's so many people involved. It's never just like, the founders.
Yeah.
So
the lone genius.
Right, exactly. Like there's simply not. And so there became more characters who entered the world or who I kind of started developing as foils, and that allowed me to broaden the world a bit. And over time I got more like endeared of those characters, particularly Lucille. Like Lucille, who, was so one-dimensional that her name is an Arrested Development joke. Like that's how kind of like, fleeting she was at first. I realized that she had like a really important like point of view and presence in this world, and so she started, being a big presence in Brendan's life after Al dies. And that fills in a lot of the, I think, structure, especially of like the middle part, in a way that feels essential to me now. So I had like the
Yeah.
basic structure, but there's a lot of like connective tissue that kind of happened organically once I began. And I think once I started like thinking more about, you know, what made for a fulfilling story, but like the general, like the very, very basic, like rising and falling emotional states. Like I try and think about like the emotions that that these characters are operating at any given time. That felt pretty consistent from fairly early on.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's the dream material. Like
Hmm.
that's all it takes is like that little subconscious thing. I that resonates with me. That a lot of my work proceeds out of some initial automatic or dream image. I don't.
Yeah.
I like the. I have always liked the mid-century surrealists and their like attitude towards. I don't know, the idea that like there's a lot of stuff going on in your head that you're not consciously engaging with, that most of what you are and what your brain is not really you in a way that is consciously graspable, and that every kind of resonant and worthwhile creative thing comes out of a part of yourself that you're not fully aware of. I find that kind of beautiful in a way that I don't I'm a materialist about it, I think, but like that resonates with me. And in a way, it's like an emblem of, well, how do I say this? When you're doing a comic like this front to back, you're always kind of playing this weird game with the readers, I imagine, where you are presenting to them an image of a thing that is more planned than you ever were actually able to plan it.
Yeah, I would say so.
So, like
Yeah.
in my experience, I have been able to, or I have attempted to present that image of a thing being planned by holding to those initial thematic and emotional pressures in the image, in the initial image that you're talking about in your dream. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I see what you mean.
Like, you can, if you have big thematic and emotional guidelines to inform your later planning, then it can look like it's all a lot more planned than it is. That's how it has come to look for me.
Hmm.
But I don't know. Oh, Human Star just has this whole like two timelines structure that lends a strong sense of organization and cohesion to it that is
Thank
just
you.
admirable. I would say it's really a fucking cool book.
Thank you. I'm still really fond of it. I really love the characters a lot. And again, I think it's something that's interesting is that now that it's finished and now that people have had the chance to be with it for a while or reflect on it even, my relationship with my readership has become really like interesting and valuable to me, especially because I feel like there's a substantial distinction to make between the people who are reading it in real time, like where they were kind of like spoon fed a page every week,
Hmm.
versus people who are reading it in book or PDF form. Because there's kind of, and this isn't just exclusive to OHS, this is like, serialized media in general, but like that waiting, sitting and waiting, and the speculation and people kind of like sharing ideas with each other or reading into things that are correct or incorrect, but as kind of a like communal activity is
Yeah.
really interesting to me. And I feel like there's also kind of, especially for the sort of like conclusion that Oh Human Star has and the sort of like characters that they are, I think that is a relationship that's especially impactful for certain readers. And I take
Hmm.
that really seriously because some people, you know, have a very like strong connection to it and they appreciate what I did. And I really try to like take that that trust and that appreciation seriously, because it you know that comes from a really sincere place for readers.
Well, firstly, that sort of to me demands the question of like, what is it like interfacing with an audience now when your work recently has been like entire projects put out there at once, right? The what adversary and across the field of stars, is that what it's called?
Across the Field of Starlight, and yeah, it's funny because those two books could not be different from each other in some ways, and it's really interesting seeing readers come from one text and discover the others, especially if they start with Starlight first,
Mm-hmm.
because in some ways that is like my most accessible book. And I like literally, I mean that it's the thing that's like most easy to find in a library or a school system. It's middle grade, it's, from a big publisher. Like
It's
it's
somewhat flashier in its genre presentation.
Yeah, like it's accessible. And I think what's really interesting is, especially since I am a teacher of college student, like, people in their like late teens, early 20s, is that what's happened more than once is, a student will be familiar with my work and that will be their entry point. And then they will like, they're kind of curious. Like the school library has faculty books in there, so they'll find them and they'll be like, "Whoa, what is this?"
Mm-hmm.
Just of Oh Human Star. Like we're not even getting into like adversary, but I find that it's really interesting, you know, having that be their entry point and then finding these other things that are less like mainstream or just more challenging in certain ways. And you know
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of interesting, especially people tend to connect with my work if they are if they have a complex relationship with their gender, right? Like I talk about like gender and sexuality a lot in my work. And especially if someone is like on the younger side or kind of like coming from a more mainstream point of view and find my work and like are engaging with my work, that is a very interesting dynamic also. Because it kind of like is a I don't know. It's sort of like how like everybody reads Shel Silverstein and then a handful of people will find like the comics he did for Playboy or whatever.
Yeah.
Or just like, finding the grown-up work that all of these like, you know, people who
Yeah.
have made more accessible work have made, or mainstream work.
I've had that experience a little. I mean, I've not done grown up work in the same way as you, but I've had that experience a little of like people coming to the island books that I did, which are very
Mm.
overtly like sort of flashy, pulpy for kids things, and then like my other stuff is somewhat more obtuse.
Hmm.
So when do you think of the Starlight book as a? I mean, did you approach that as like I'm gonna make something that is more for a broader, more pop cultural audience?
I mean, not necessarily. I mean, when I was reached out by to I was reached out to do a project like that by Gina Gagliano, who was the editor at the time for Random House Graphic.
Gina is. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Gina is how I got connected with First Second. Gina was
Oh,
working
that
with First
rules.
Second at the time years ago. That's hilarious.
Yeah,
She's
like
great.
yeah, she understood the like web comics landscape, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she had a good eye for recognizing the kind of things that people are good at doing and that they want to do, and basically trying to make a space for something like that in the middle grade or YA sphere, which I think is like a really interesting project. Um, because like, it's a paycheck and you can still make like interesting work that way, but also it opens an interesting door for, you know, younger readers who want to like continue finding work later.
Yeah.
But like I was interested in making a space opera that was like just like a different scale of science fiction than what I typically did. I was already sort of, regardless of middle grade or not, I was interested in the idea of like the long distance correspondence relationship, like people who communicate over distances or stretches of time from different cultures. Like that sort of thing is just interesting to me in fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, there were lots of themes that come with like, you know, post scarcity society fiction or faster than light travel that I have seen executed well in prose that would be fun. I thought would be fun to try and adapt to my storytelling style. Kind of glibly, I talk about how, you know, I wanted to like make a Le Guin-esque story, but I also kind of wanted to make like an Ian Banks style story too.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was the kind of storytelling that I thought was fun and could be made for like a younger age audience in mind without necessarily like compromising the structure or the intent of the story. Like how successful I was, I don't know. I mean, it was really ambitious and I feel like I learned a lot about like the limitations of just like the space that I had in a way that I just didn't necessarily have to think about with a webcomic. You know, with Oh Human Star, like it was as long as it was long. Like it would take as long as it takes.
Yeah.
Whereas with a print project, you have to get very good very quickly at estimating just how much space something will take and add on 100 pages to your estimate, at least in my example.
Yeah, depending on the scale you're at. Yeah, that absolutely resonates with me. And then if you're doing typically if you're doing a book for a publisher, you have to like go through and thumbnail the whole thing and give them these really rigorous estimates at every point in the process about how ambitious it actually is.
Yeah,
which
like
totally
I think is like a good
of
thing to do. And like my editor Whit Leopard for that book was really like I think also super aware and savvy of how these things work, because turned in my initial pitch with an outline, like a story outline, and Whit was like, "That's great. Let's add on like 100 pages to this estimate." And she was like, "Exactly right."
Mm-hmm. It's very ambitious. I read that a little while ago, so it's not as loud in my memory as Oh Human Star and Adversary, but it holds together. It feels really ambitious and it like builds in an interesting way, and it absolutely is a Le Guin-y sort of a thing.
Yeah,
which is
I tried.
Crazy. Like she's such a formative voice in like, I don't know, politically articulate genre fiction. Mm-hmm. That I feel like it hasn't percolated into comics really at all. So it's nice to see people working with her ideas working with ideas that are sort of alongside her interests. You know, not that they're her ideas. You know what I mean?
But yeah, like the approach to storytelling, or just the approach to how people and culture are rendered in storytelling, or
wow, this does actually connect to a thing I wanted to talk about. There's this. I'm okay. I'm giving maybe Le Guin herself too much credit by pinning this on her, but she's the writer who like made this click for me personally. This idea that like we can write genre fiction and we can at the same time take the genre material super literally and seriously as writers, and also we can take its allegorical political resonance seriously. So we can have a story about robots and transferring people's minds into robot bodies and stuff, and we can take that seriously as like a technological, poetic idea. But then also we can take seriously the whole allegorical dimension of it as a way of talking about the trans experience and various ideas around embodiment that you're working through in Oh Human Star.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Oh, I have so many thoughts, Evan, on this, especially because I feel like I was not 1,000% aware of what I was doing when I started Oh Human Star.
That rocks.
Like I
That's
said,
so
I had
cool.
I had this like dream, and I was really drawn to these characters, and you know, I was picking away at them. I realized at some point that like Al and Brendan were lovers, and Scylla is like obviously a like iteration of Al's mind, like under different circumstances. And like I had just enough like awareness at, 21 years old to be like, I feel like I need to like be reading more queer fiction to make sure I'm understanding this properly. As an ally, like I feel like I should do my due diligence. And I did. And I proceeded to, read a lot of like queer web comics and just kind of like I went to my school's GSA and just sort of like I don't know, like I really earnestly at the time, very enthusiastically in retrospect, dove into really understanding like what I thought I was trying to do, because it did feel like there was something happening that felt like coherent and correct. And it was only after like a couple of years of like, Tumblr queer education that I, started having like personal revelations about it and kind of like understanding what I was, why it was so appealing to me personally. But yeah, no, especially like as the story went on and as I became more interested in how like queer identity, trans identity, like body stuff, one's presence like as a like digital and analog entity that extends through time and space, like how all of those things connect, even like like disability politics and just like in general, all of these things have a coherence that when you see them as like a holistic series of ideals and thoughts, they all make sense together. And I feel like there's kind of it becomes so porous that you almost stop thinking of the like boundary between like allegory and literal.
Oh,
Like they
that's
all kind of have
beautiful.
something to do with each other.
I
Like,
love that way of putting it. Thank you.
yeah, my
Well, no, and
pleasure,
you
I
can see
guess.
that. You can see that in Oh Human Star, because I got hung up on this thing because I'm somewhat too uptight and analytical when I think about this stuff, maybe. But there's
Hmm.
this. You are doing this thing with allegory where there's several points where characters will talk about their experience of living in a robot body, and you are obviously, I think, consciously using that as a metaphorical way of talking about trans experience. Like there's this whole conversation about passing, but
Yeah,
it is the people talking about it are talking about passing as human when they're a robot person. But then
yeah,
also at the same time as you're doing that allegorical trick, you have characters who are literally talking about a literal, intelligible trans experience. So like it feels porous to me, like you're working on it on different levels. It's
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and I think that that's, this like kind of combination of things is definitely not something that I came up with, right? This is something that I think is really common across, narrative about like robots and AI and cyborgs. I mean, Ghost in the Shell is such a like trans coded, celebrated, The Matrix, like all of these things
Yeah.
where like there is sort of a, a disconnect or a trying to like make sense of the distance between your body and your mind, your image and your reputation, like your sort of like your your presence and your limitations, like those things are to an extent like universal. Like I feel like lots of people have thoughts about how they are different as people from one part of their lives to the next. Like honestly, I feel like Brendan's story in a lot of ways, like Brendan is like character wise the closest to me just in terms of like personality and like life trajectory. And Brendan also goes through that,
Hmm.
experience of fundamentally changing as a person and having, mixed like feelings and regrets about who he used to be and who he is now. Like I think that's universal up to an extent, but yeah, there's also a like a fraughtness that comes with the expectations of stuff that is seamless for other people, or like the difficulties are smoothed away for other people with stuff like gender or disability, or even like honestly something that like started happening with readers who were reading O Human Star over the years was, a lot of people think about like neurodiversity, right? Like lots of people read Alan Sulla's, like neuro like divergent in one way or another, which I found really interesting because I didn't go in with that intentional idea, but I can see how they got there, and that feels like that's in that same kind of interpretive space. So I think that's super cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think that's like a big part of transhumanist fiction, and like, like that. And I think that's like something that happens with like body horror narratives as well, or just like lots of science fiction things in general. Like those go along very comfortably with like trans allegory and queer allegory and all kinds of other allegory.
Yeah. I feel what you're saying about like a lot of the core ideas about like, you know, being in a gender, be like, how do I say this? I feel like I have to be very articulate about this. Like I'm a cisgender person, but I have ambivalence about how I'm perceived in ways that are like at odds with my gender and stuff. There's all sorts of ways of bouncing up against these problems that are absolutely more fraught and intense and should be more focused on in the case of the trans experience. But obviously, we're all human beings navigating similar spaces. So it makes it, so yes, that's
Yeah,
I'm
I
echoing
understand
you're
what you
saying.
mean. I think that's like a really like a not uncommon experience is a like discomfort or an ambivalence or like a chafing of your own personal like sense of like gender identity or sexuality or anything with expectations put on you from outside, and how that navigates with like how you interact with like the state machine, or just like bureaucratic nonsense, or just kind of like cultural stuff. There's a component of it that is very, I think, like there's a discomfort that at least everybody experiences to some extent. It's not like so uncommon. But yeah, with
I would assume
like
everybody. I mean, I want to imagine the person who feels total comfort in the circumstances of the culture and the world around them.
yeah, I
Imagine.
mean you would think like, and I feel like, it would have to be to explain a lot of like the reactionary responses, especially even like, you know, specifically like anti-trans like reactionary stuff. I feel like that wouldn't hit so hard if that wasn't connecting with, a discomfort or a like what's the word? Like a perceived disjointedness that people are recognizing, even just, bullshit gender norm stuff. Like
Yeah.
people do recognize that, and, they just have like their own reactions to it because they don't know what to do. Like they don't know how to resolve that in a way that, works within the comfort of their own ideology. Like everybody is kind of, that is my assumption. No, I think that's something that is like a space in narrative fiction that I really enjoy, and that I found more and more I am less patient with people who refuse to even consider like the queer and trans narratives. Like even I think there's even like, cis creators that understand this and are willing to like earnestly play in the space. That is fine. But yeah, there's a lot of like, like extremely hetero science fiction nonsense that is like so boring to me now.
Do you mean like they're
Because
unwilling to they're unwilling to look at queer dimensions of media that already exists, or like as writers? What do you mean
Yeah,
exactly?
I mean like as writers, like people who are making stories about, like, let's just like say AI for example. You know, the idea of making a narrative that is about the concept of artificial intelligence, and, you know, or maybe like a person coming back from the dead as a like as a bot or whatever, you know, a series of like recorded conversations or metadata that has been formed into a like simulacrum of that person, or even just like, you know, a android or a physical manifestation of a like person that has to be interacted with, you know, physically, whether that is just like, you know, can you have sex with this robot, or, you know, does this robot have to like fight a war, or, you know, I feel like there's a lot of stories about robots, a lot of stories about AI where the considerations or fears that they're trying to evoke are so surface level or so comfortable within, I think, like the mainstream canon, that it's like extremely boring. Like boring to said that's like irritating.
I think I know what you mean. Well, there was this thought that I had reading "O Human Star" that like it. I'm unused to. I'm not used to seeing fiction that talks about things like transferring a brain into another body, or like you know, some of the big sort of theory of mind type ideas in "O Human Star." I'm not used to seeing them presented without this like creepiness built into it, and
Mm-hmm.
like that's kind of there in "O Human Star," but it's interesting that you are taking these genre ideas, a lot of which are have been around in pop culture for a while, but you are using them in a way that I do not ever see. You know?
That's, yeah, no, I that's interesting to hear because, yeah, I guess I didn't really like lean into that idea of like making it sinister. The main tone I think of "Oh Human Star" is like sadness or
Yeah.
regret almost.
If it were like a real thing, if you could like really copy a person's brain and put it into a fake body, that feels profoundly sinister to me. But
Yeah.
it's a literary device for you. It's in a piece of fiction, and you're using it to talk about stuff that's evocative in totally different ways. And so I don't mean to say that you're like, you know, that you should have hit on that angle or whatever. That's not what you're interested in doing with the idea. It's
Hmm.
just
No, I
it's
understand.
cool to see.
Yeah, I like. I think there's a lot of ways to approach that, of which like "Oh Human Star" is just one possible iteration of it. But yeah, I think it's always really interesting when, you know, science fiction of any stripe is just like written from a very like surface level
Yeah.
like fears or reactions, or just like not thinking about, you know, the different kinds of people, you know, and I'm not talking about like necessarily talking about like capital D diversity, but just like the different kind of like anxieties people can have, or the motivations people can have, or the like background experiences people can have, and how those inform how they feel about these like these possible things that can happen to them.
Mhm.
I think betrays a lack of like curiosity in the world and in other people, that like, you know, is not
Yeah.
good, like from a writer standpoint, or just kind of like a person being in the world standpoint.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of media is made under such under pressures that don't allow for that sort of exploratory thinking and writing. You know, if you're
Yeah.
making something pop cultural, if you're making like a movie or whatever,
Hmm.
there's a lot of like money and moving parts, and there's a lot of opportunities for that sort of thoughtful shit to get sanded out of the process. You know, this is an
Right.
opportunity to me. Like this is why comics are so beautiful to me, is because it can be just an enormous, inexpensive, comparatively inexpensive commitment of an individual person who's obsessed in a particular idiosyncratic direction with what they're doing. You know.
Yeah. No,
That rocks.
absolutely. Like you can get very granular to a particular experience or a particular like theme that you return to again and again, and that can like change and grow over the course of a person's career, that I also think is like really interesting. And I think like as I've become a comic scholar, I think that that is a component of it that I'm finding that I'm increasingly interested in, is how a particular artist or writer, whoever, how their storytelling style changes over the years based on what their interests are or what happens to them or what they witness or whatever. Like I think that's interesting.
Where are you at now? What are you working on now? You said you had an interest in doing doing like more self-published webcomic stuff, but that's not what you've been working on, I gather.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk a bit about what I've been working on in the meantime, which is basically I've had the chance to do some graphic novels. Well, I've had a chance to do a graphic novel, and I'm in the process of working on another one that is a little bit more of a collaborative thing. And then I've had the chance to do some shorter one-off experimental things, which is experimental in that these are not like genres or styles I typically do, and I am not beholden to have them connect to anything I've done before. So that let me go off the rails, such as Adversary, um,
Is that
which
are you? These are the things you did for the short box.
yeah, Adversary was my first entry to the first short box that I was accepted to, which was 2022. Um, it was basically me trying to synthesize the last several years, basically in between when I completed Oh Human Star and 2022, wherein I spent the pandemic in Minneapolis becoming even more transgender than I was before. And I was just like synthesizing a lot of things in a way that um, is interesting to look at in context of Oh Human Star, because genre wise and tone wise, it's very different, but it is also about a May December relationship experiencing like a big social change. So it's kind of like a weird, bizarro version of some of the things that I was exploring in Oh Human
Hmm.
Star, just from a different personal lens.
There's some parallel ideas, absolutely, and I mean it
Yeah.
feels more contiguous to me just because it's like your aesthetic in both of those projects, but it wouldn't look that way to you necessarily. I liked Adversary a lot.
A lot of
Um,
people liked Adversary way more than I was expecting them to be honest. I
it's
was really being very opaque, and I think or I was not trying to make it accessible in the way that previous projects had been.
isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, like the fact that it's such a, I don't know, as things get more specific and personal, maybe they're less accessible, but they're more, I don't know, they're more interesting, and I don't know. I thought it was cool. Um, what was I going to say about it? The interesting thing to me is that it's such a fucking kink. We don't have to talk about this
We can.
if it's too personal or whatever, but it's such a kink thing. I mean, the whole premise is based on this specific fictionalized the self defense training thing is like such a specific fictionalized thing. So the whole story becomes like this horny kink thing
Mhm.
that foregrounds the deliberate fictionalization of that sort of space in a way that you rarely see, I feel like, in horny fiction. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about it is that like I'm not a like career kinkster in the way that people often are. You know, I think in that space especially, like that is very much like a part of their lifestyle in a way that is just realistically not for me. Which is not to say that it's like no relevance, but it definitely like represents a like I think a maturation of my thoughts about kink and like kind of reflecting like my thoughts about like gender and sexuality that I feel like is kind of inexorably tied to kink, even though lots of people don't want to think that it does.
Hmm.
And I think it was also like as I was trying to like sort out these ideas that do come from a personal perspective, which really has to do more with going to a self-defense class that was aimed specifically at women in like 2017 and trying to like figure out where my head was at in terms of like what does it mean to have gone to like a self-defense class in that way, you know, as a non-woman basically, but also thinking about violence that is, the understanding is that it will be perpetrated by like, you know, older like bigger guys that are meant to be scary, and that is absolutely like character type that is like a you know an attractive character type to me, like in fiction. And
Hmm.
trying to sort out all those ideas led to a really interesting, like, kind of like in the way that Oh Human Star made me think more deliberately about what I was trying to do with like trans and queer narratives. It made me think more about kink in a way that, I think was
Yeah.
to its benefit.
These things become like external brains for us. Like we spend so much time making them, they become a way of thinking through things that it's like a superpower kind of. It's
Yeah,
I
it's kind
love
of
that
like
part of it.
in some ways it can kind of be like an experimental laboratory in a way to like work through ideas before you want to enact them in real life, if you ever want to. I mean, a lot of times that is like a great way to sort out stuff that is like, you know, bad for your mental health, or shall we say extremely antisocial, and it can be a good way to like explore those ideas
Yeah.
without having it infringe on your everyday life. But it can also be a way for you to think about those ideas so that you can like be less scared of them and then execute them in your real life if you want to. Like it's
Yeah.
very useful in that way.
So you basically engineered your brain to be a constant generator of queer allegory, resident queer allegories. Am I
I
wrong?
can't turn it off. Yeah, I mean that's kind of like that's what I feel like is kind of funny, is that once you start thinking about things in a queer way, you almost by necessity have to think about everything in a queer way,
Yeah.
because like there's so much fuel you can add to that fire, and also it just is a way for you to like you know I like reevaluate social relationships, or it can be a new way to like detect like bullshit, like mainstream ideology in a way that may have not felt right to you before, but now you have a better language as to why. But yeah, no, like it's great to queer things in the way that like, scholars use it as a verb. It's great. I love it.
Great. And you have so Shortbox. I only have really been paying attention to it this year. I just bought a bunch of stuff. It's such a wild fucking idea.
Hmm.
I mean, as this podcast goes up, it will have just launched the new one, and you have a new comic in it this year, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Which was like a speed running thing. What's that about?
Yeah, it's basically is about a video game speedrunner in a undefined near future who specializes in a niche game that you can only perceive and interact with things through sound and touch. Like it is a game where you play a blind protagonist, and this is a story that presupposes that, as with video games in real life, people will find absurd and like elaborate ways to perform those games to conclusion. And this speedrunner chooses a crowded underground mall, the Toronto Path, to run through this augmented reality game. while being bombarded with real life stimuli as well as video game stimuli. So it is kind of a like it is about speed running, but it is also very much about the panopticon and public bathrooms and existing in public life. It is again kind of a way for me to synthesize a lot of things that's a little less serious than Adversary, but like I felt like there was a lot there that could like work with each other, so I went for it.
That is just horrifyingly high concept. I cannot imagine that seems difficult to articulate. That I'm interested to read it.
Yeah, I keep doing this to myself, and I feel like I have a lot of high concept ideas that probably should not be short stories, and half of my creative process is trying to figure out how to make them work as short stories. I think this one turned out pretty fun. I got to do some cool, like, visual and technical stuff for it that I think turned out pretty good.
I look forward to see it. No, I don't mean that as a read. I mean you're following your particular interests in a extremely fixated way. That's where the juice is, man. It's a shame that so much of this stuff is about having to compress your ideas because comics are so inefficient to make. Like they can't all be at the scale of a human star, you know?
Yeah, that's true. Although there are some things where I feel like it can often be in the service of the story to compress it, because some things that are, you know, punchier or have more of an impact when it's kind of in like a more finite space or situation can get a little like bloated or not have as much of an impact if you draw it out. I mean, in the case of Bleed Any Percent, like I do feel like there is a lot of interesting possibilities that I try to introduce by making that world feel like a real space. But it's one of those things, right, where it's like, is it really worthwhile continuing to add on to that world, or is it better to let those possibilities exist in the mind of the reader, right? Like, is it really to the service of the story if I just like kept adding on to this world forever?
Yeah, that's very sensible. I just like so much of my so much of my sense of like what a story is, I guess, comes out of like a prose novel, which is just necessarily hundreds of times more space and thoughtfulness and complexity than can fit into like a comparative number of comics pages. It feels like.
Yeah, like it's like that's a bit much bigger time investment.
Yeah. Oof, I'm kind of losing my train of thought.
We were kind of talking about like Shortbox as like a concept or like as a event. I mean, it's a really cool. At this point, it's been going like at least 4 years. I want to say I would have to double check. It's been at least 4. But yeah, like as a institution, which it's kind of almost become at this point, like being run by one person, like Zainab Akhtar, who has like a particular like taste and like curatorial sense of like grabbing like, you know, inviting people all around the world to contribute work and having this balance of people who are more established and then people who for whom this is kind of their first project of this scale ever. And like it's an undertaking that it would be really interesting to have that be something that multiple people do according to their like tastes and priorities or whatever, now that like we know that the model works. But again, it's one of those things where, you know, how much of it is because this is like one of the singular examples of this kind of thing, and you know, what would be healthy growth and what would be competition.
Yeah.
It's hard to know, but like it just works so well, and there's so many like amazing artists I have found through this one person's taste that I would really like to see iterations of that pull from like particular countries more, or particular genres more, or being specifically themed. Like I think there's so much runway to this idea of like a digital time limited comic fair.
Yeah, it's one of those things that like yeah, it absolutely. I agree with you. It seems like it's a sort of thing that could exist in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
The a big part of the reason why this one seems to work is because of the obvious curatorial taste, but also it's a lot of work being done and released exclusively over the course. Like it's exclusively through Shortbox over the course of the month of Shortbox, is my understanding.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's
that
like, it's all October.
yeah, that's a big deal. Like it being all exclusive to that time and it being all, I mean, people obviously will get paid for the sales that they make, but it's all on spec effectively, you know. I mean, it's not on spec sounds like I'm talking about them being
Yeah.
exploited by a publisher. I don't mean that. I mean, they own the work, they make the money off the work, but it's a lot of upfront work.
Yeah.
So
And there's like,
it's
there had to have been established that like groundwork of like, okay, well, this has worked this many times before. So you kind of like, you can
yeah.
anticipate kind of like how, you know, crowdfunds from a publisher, say, whose like amount of like, you know, return you could expect, or at least, you know, possibly anticipate. It is kind of like an interesting model that is, you know, uneven, definitely, but you know, it's cool to see that it's worked to the extent that it has, because it very well
Yeah.
could not have, and could have just been a total bust.
And the fact that it, you know, you end up with a whole finished thing that you own that you can publish through, you can self publish or whatever. After Adversary was out with Silver Sprocket, right?
Yeah, I mean, initially I just self printed a run by myself, and I think it was like literally like a couple days after I placed that print order that Silver Sprocket reached out to me. And they were like, "Hey, we'd like to publish this," and I was like, "Ah, your timing, man." I mean, it worked out, like, but I did have a like that opportunity to
Yeah.
self publish a print version that got nominated for an Ignatz. And, you know, it gave me another venue to share this and see the responses to it, which again, like, I think it was very, like, been very interesting to see the reaction that it's gotten. There's one guy, I think I picked it up at SPX on like Saturday and came back the next day, not this past year, but like the year before. And I'll never forget what he said. He very like politely was like, "I think I liked this. I don't know if I understand it." And I like admire this guy's honesty,
That's
because I do
beautiful.
think it's one of those things where it's very, you know, if you are like in a certain time at a certain place, or if you have a certain kind of life experience, it'll mean more to you than others perhaps, or you'll recognize things. But I do like that idea of reading or witnessing something that is like completely outside of your lived experience and making do. That I like a lot.
That's, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I love most about, I mean, I love not fully understanding a thing.
Oh yeah.
I feel like that experience needs to be like advocated for as a writer and a reader, you know?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that is counterintuitive to the current mainstream reading landscape that I think people are pushing back against more.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I
it
hope
is
so. Yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
Like the idea that the counter idea being that like everything has to be really palatable and comfortable and self-explanatory and
Right.
I don't know if this is a productive angle of discussion. It's just an anxiety thing I've been working through. The different audiences interact with the thing in different ways. The people who read it on Webtoon, I don't want to be rude or dismissive of them, but they don't have the same sort of familiarity with what I'm doing as people who read my stuff in other platforms. So often over the course of Third Voice, I've had people being like, I don't understand what's happening. I assume that with the implication being, I assume that somewhere else there's like lore that I can read to explain it to, but there isn't, of course. It's just, a somewhat deliberately opaque text.
They want an overside wiki that they can
Yeah.
refer to.
Yeah, well, a different setting, but yes.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
It's I don't expect you to keep track of all these things. But yeah, like that's a thing that sometimes frustrates me a little.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the way in which I connect with the angle on allegory that we were talking about. Like, in making a story set in a fictional setting, I'm trying to do the same thing where I'm trying to like treat the fictional setting as like a literalistic existing thing, but I'm also trying to foreground its utility as a literary device and as like an allegorical tool. And
like sometimes things just work better as a story when you don't have all the parts or all the fragments.
Yeah, because in a way, it's a credit to me to have people be like, I don't understand all of this setting, but I assume that it makes sense and I want to know how it makes sense. But I'm laying it out in a way that's deliberately sort of, partial and opaque because that's what the story is,
Right. And I think that is a format that is less familiar and less welcome in some online spaces than others. Like, I think there are certain kinds of narratives where followers or readers or whatever are punished by other followers or readers by not being adequately informed. And there's almost like a expected level of literacy or familiarity with a like world or a backstory or whatever that everybody needs to be on the same page about. And sometimes like that lore is like generated by the fans, right? Like there's kind of like a collectively understood narrative that is not, from the writers, but everyone kind of shares the same backstory and deviation is not tolerated. But, that is not the case with all literature. I think a lot of times that is the case for, like video game franchises or film franchises or whatever, just like narratives that most people have some experience with in one way or another. And I feel like there aren't as many examples in like books that they would have had to read, say, in like school, or, like the books that people tend to get attached to are like, like the Song of Ice and Fire series or something where there's lore that like everybody can be on the same page about. Like, it's not like, I don't know, we're going back to the Le Guin well, but I read Always Coming Home for the first time this year. And that's kind of like an
banger. nobody reads that one. I love that fucking book.
I'm in the process. Okay, so I've been talking to Otava Hecula, who has told me that he has started reading Le Guin. And I was like, Otava, you must read Always Coming Home. I have to see what you think of it. But that's kind of like the example of that. It's like artifacts and fragments of a world where there simply isn't any more. What is in the book is in the book, and like maybe the accompanying CD of like music that like Le Guin made with a buddy of hers, but like that's it. There simply isn't any more, and so it's like fun and frustrating to piece together from what isn't there and like jump to conclusions, and like make the chicken and lentil recipes in the back, but like everything else is kind of up to readers to generate if they wish. But like there isn't going to be a Na River community wiki to like, generate that critical mass.
Yeah. Man, that's it. I mean, that's the fault line that I'm interested in about this stuff. Like this weird attitude towards objectivity and like knowing all of the details of some invented literary thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you Do you miss making a thing and publishing it as you make it and having an audience engage in a sort of community with it in the ways that you're talking? Is
I
because this is not
do.
a thing you've engaged with in a while.
Yeah, I do honestly miss it. And, there were things about it that were like kind of irritating, or there was that like, I feel like there was like the hour after I press publish on a page where I wait for the people to point out the like spelling errors or tangents or whatever that, I don't miss. But I do think about the ways in which I can create that like collective reaction and speculation on something in a way that is like different from what I did for Oh Human Star, which for like all its like features is like one singular story, like from just like a handful of people's point of view. What I would really like to do is I have an idea for a project, let's say, that is like a series of short stories that are from different people's perspectives over a period of time. And I would love that like period of time to be reflected in the structure of the website. Like that's kind of what I feel like would invoke that like joy of discovery of the like digital space, is to want to go into the website and see what's changed in a way that you couldn't just get off of like the webtoon mirror.
Yeah,
Like I think
that's a
that would be cool. I just would
that
have to
is
like
cool.
really sit and plan it in a way that like even more so than I did I think for Oh Human Star.
That is cool. I've been intermittently doing something like there's a sort of a like gamification aspect to the my third voice publication where there's like little hidden things. I haven't really foregrounded it enough or whatever, but I feel like that's an exciting angle.
Yeah.
I think that the superpose people have something like that. Like there's
Oh
some sort of
yeah.
false document
They're doing an
gamified
interesting thing where
aspects.
they're thinking about like physical objects that you can collect. Like I
Oh,
haven't collected any, but like I do think about it. Like you can get a postcard from like the city in which it takes place. You can get the like
oh, that's
weird
cool.
like pseudo religious tract that is from the like cult that a protagonist like father was like pulled
Yeah,
into. Like there's like Polaroids and like ID cards and just things that are like it almost feels like it's a disservice to call it an ARG, because it's not really like an ARG the way we think of ARGs. It's just like it's just a extension of this like kind of incomplete story, but just into the physical realm. That is like really,
yeah.
really interesting as a concept.
That's cool. I mean, that sounds like exactly the sort of your idea you're talking about. Sounds like exactly the sort of uh, allegorically resonant, high context shit that would interest you. So I am excited for you to pursue that at some point.
Yeah, again, I want to. It's been on the back burner. I've got like notebooks of my like thoughts and reference and research I've been doing for it. I just have projects that I keep needing to take instead to make money,
Hmm.
which I don't dislike. Like the most of the projects I've been doing are like interesting or challenging in their own way. They just, are in spaces that are not the webcomic space.
Yeah, and a lot of the dynamics are different. And I mean, uh, having some guarantee of money up front for something is very different from I'm going to do a bunch of work that I own, but on no guarantee of of making
Yeah,
money on it later.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
whenever I do make money on it, it'll be my money, all of it. So that's something. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's tricky. Well, what else do we want to talk about here? I think we've this has gone pretty well, right? Blue,
Yeah, yeah, dude, I think this has gone pretty well.
lovely to talk to you.
It's fun. I always have like a good time talking to you about stuff because I feel like you similarly operate on a level of like thinking about high concept things or the state of the art form in a way that I often think about too. So it's cool to like talk with someone who knows what both Always Coming Home and Sinfest are and like synthesize those into a conversation.
Oh man, I wonder how many people like that there are in the world.
God, there's probably like 8.
Are you reading anything interesting right now lately?
What am I reading right now? In my bag. So I take the bus a lot and I have a lot of bus commutes. So I usually have like a library book in my bag at any given time. I am currently reading a series of short stories by, I'm going to do my best to pronounce this, Asya Bakic, who is a Bosnian author. It's a lot of like sci-fi and sci-fi adjacent short stories. I also have my ongoing pandemic hobby of reading every Deep Space Nine novel that there is. I actually read one earlier this year that might be up there for one of the best books I read this year, period. I forget. Did you ever watch DS9?
Oh, a chunk of it. Enough to know that I should watch more of it. Next Generation is kind of my platonic ideal Star Trek personally, but I will watch more of Deep Space Nine. I liked it.
That's fair. Did you watch enough to be familiar with Garrick, the disgraced lizard gay spy?
Disgraced lizard, yes.
Yeah. There is a book called A Stitch in Time that was written by his actor, Andrew Robinson, who normies may also recognize as the antagonist of, I think it was Dirty Harry. Very, very intense guy. I met him last year at a Star Trek convention. And because it was the year of the strike, you could only really talk to people if it was about things that were not Star Trek. Right. So he had like written this book, like years and years ago he'd read this book, but he'd recently released an audiobook version of it. And so I talked with him about a bit about books that he liked to read, and he like in this very intensive, it's like, oh yes, I like Barbara Kingsolver. I've been reading this, and this. And I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to seek out, this book. And it turns out this one book in particular is like the white whale of DS9 novel collectors. It's very hard to find in print. So I listened to the audiobook. And I was like genuinely floored. It was very competently written. He has some like interesting ideological things he wants to say. Like he clearly like thinks about his character's motivations a lot. Like
that is
it was
so
a good,
crazy. For the actor to invest that in building the thing out. That's so cool. I've never even heard of that.
It's not like there's like no precedent for that, like in Star Trek media, especially. Like there's a handful of like books about the Ferengi that have like Armin Shimmerman's participation, I think. But yeah, no, this one particular, like I understand now why people are particularly hyped about this one. It's definitely doing something interesting. I've seen it compared in structure to like a gothic romance, and like reading it, I was like, okay, that kind of tracks. So yeah,
that's interesting.
Just lots of reading all the time.
Mostly lately, I'm just reading things to get ready to interview people. So I just read this great little comic called "Oh Human Star."
Okay.
And that's our show.
that your smooth segue to the ending music.
Right? Does that sound good? Does that work?
That works. It works as good as anything.
And folks, that's our show.